Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at the different types of markets that firms operate in, whether they're perfectly competitive markets or the various levels of imperfect competition. So basically, if we were to look at the different firm types that are out there, we could say that if we put them on some sort of long continuum, something like that, where we look at the different levels of competition, we would have perfectly competitive markets at one extreme and monopolies at another extreme. So these are perfectly competitive markets and these are monopolies. Very few perfectly competitive markets exist and very few monopolies exist. Our government has very strong antitrust laws that squash monopoly because we know that as more firms enter the market, more competition brings prices down. There are two things that competition does. One, it brings prices down because firms have to compete for our business. And two, it brings quality up. So take some of the big monopolies out there. Even look at places like PG&E. PG&E doesn't have to spend a lot of money on research and development because consumers don't have a choice on where to get energy from. They don't need to be as efficient as they would be if they were perfectly competitive markets. So perfectly competitive markets are the most efficient markets and monopolies are the least efficient markets. So as more firms come into the marketplace, prices go down and quality goes up. Now, there are not very many of either of these two types of markets. The majority of the markets that are out there are going to be monopolistically competitive markets. Monopolistically competitive markets means that there are a lot of markets that are competing for our business and they try to differentiate their product. So, for example, for perfectly competitive markets, we see this usually in agriculture. One of the assumptions of the perfectly competitive market is that you can't tell the good apart. So, for example, if we look at rice, unless I told you which field a bag of organic rice came from, you wouldn't be able to differentiate it from another bag of rice, even if I didn't label that it was organic. For monopolistically competitive firms, the way that they are able to try and hold on to a small amount of the market share is to differentiate their product from the other firms that are out there. Monopolies, they don't need to worry about product differentiation because there's no competition. And then the last segment of the markets that exist are what we call oligopolies. And an oligopoly is when there's a very small number of firms that control the majority of the market share. So some examples of oligopolies, well, anytime that we have a cartel, that's definitely an oligopolies. Oligopolies can be as little as two firms in the market. Two firms in the market are a special case where we call them a duopoly. So I guess we could say right here within the oligopoly exists a duopoly. So in a good way to study all of this stuff for the different type of firms is to make kind of a flow chart or cheat sheet and look at different ways that we can categorize these four market types. So the first thing that we could do is look at them and differentiate them by the number of firms in the market. Okay, so a monopoly has exactly one. A duopoly has two. An oligopoly has, we'll say few. That's a W, few. A monopolistically competitive firm has a lot, very many. We could say, we'll say many. And then a perfectly competitive market has very many. Okay, other ways that we can look at them, besides the number of firms, we could look at how much the product is able to be differentiated. Okay, if we were looking at monopolies, it's one good, so we don't really need to worry too much about monopolies. But perfectly competitive markets, we can say that these markets are homogeneous. The good is homogeneous. Okay, meaning that one looks identical to the other. We can't tell them apart. For monopolistically competitive markets, the good or service is what we call differentiated. It can be the exact same or it can be a little bit different. So other examples of monopolistically competitive firms, jeans is always a great go-to for monopolistically competitive markets. If the labels are removed on jeans, it's relatively difficult to tell one pair of standard blue jeans from another one. Once you put on the label, then add some rhinestones or change the pockets a little bit. Now all of a sudden the jeans are getting slightly differentiated from each other. And that's why for monopolistically competitive firms, advertising is a huge industry. It's very important to have the right advertising and try and get the right name brand in order to get your product sold. For oligopolies, it depends on how they're operating. If they're a cartel and they're operating just like if they're a cartel and they're operating just like a monopoly, then we don't need to worry too much about the advertising. Okay, so now let's take a look specifically about perfectly competitive firms, and we'll go through a compare and contrast with perfectly competitive firms, how their market's structured, how their demand curve is, what the firm costs are, and how they decide to produce the correct amount of output.